Good evening, everyone. My name is Stephanie, and I am thrilled to be here with you on a fantastic Wednesday evening. I'm assuming for most people it's the evening, but if you are tuning in when it is not evening, welcome to and happy day. So my name is Stephanie. I'm the director of events for the Novel Neighbor, and I am thrilled. I know that I say this a lot, and everyone who knows me knows that I get very excited about a lot of books, but I have been looking forward to this conversation for such a long time. I was fortunate enough to read an early copy of the book that we are discussing this evening, The Cherry Robbers, months and months ago, and it was something that we actually passed around our staff. Our staff immediately fell in love with it, and so we knew we wanted to do an event for this book. We also knew that we loved it so much that it was our May subscription book. So if you're unfamiliar, we have a subscription service that we offer every month. You sign up for it, and we send you one new release from the month that we think you can't miss. Sometimes we have multiple feelings about books, but we try to pick just one that we think you really need to read that month. And for May, we really wanted everyone to read The Cherry Robbers. That's how much we love this title. So thank you so much for tuning in tonight. If you are not a subscription person, please know we have plenty of copies in the store, and we would be thrilled to get you this book, whether you come into the store or whether we ship it if you're not in St. Louis. So without any further ado, you're still going to hear a lot from me tonight. Sometimes I say I'm not the person that you're here to hear from, but you're going to hear a lot from me because I'm going to be asking lots of questions this evening of our incredible author. Look how excited I am. I'm stumbling over my words. Sarai Walker, who is the author of Cherry Robbers and Dietland, which I know so many of you have to be familiar with. Dietland has been published in more than a dozen countries and was adapted as a television series for AMC. Sarai has lectured on feminism and body image internationally and has spoken about these topics widely in the media. Her articles and essays have appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, The Guardian, and elsewhere. And she worked as a writer and editor on an updated version of Our Bodies, Ourselves. She holds an MFA in creative writing from Bennington College and a PhD in English from the University of London. So please join me in welcoming Sarai Walker. Hello.
Hello. So great to be here. Thank you for that introduction.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Hailing from, I believe, Philadelphia, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. I didn't get a chance. I forgot to tell you in the intro. That's actually where I'm from. I'm from Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. So,
wow. Well, we've got a big thunderstorm maybe rolling in. So if you hear any loud sounds, that might be what it is.
I mean, isn't that what gives virtual events their like extra little vibe? We like get a sneak peek into where we all like live or interact with on a daily basis. So yes, lots of, I hope we get to hear in the background, we got to hear a little something from your cat. I didn't ask your cat's name. What is your cat's name?
Well, her name is Shirley. Like I was inspired by Shirley Jackson and I got her while I was writing this novel. So she's very Gothic.
Oh, I love that so much.
She's not there, but we hope she behaves.
Listen, if Shirley has some things to say that she needs to let out too, we welcome all of Shirley's comments. Oh my gosh, we already have someone tuning in. Hello. Someone said they weren't sure if I would make it to this one, but here they are. So welcome. We're excited that you're here. We're excited that everyone's here. I guess what we'll start first is we will have you do a little bit of a reading, and also everyone, there will be, please drop comments, questions in the chat. I will be checking those as we have this conversation. So please feel free if there's something that I don't ask a follow-up question on, you're like, why would you not ask that? We want to know what she thinks about it. Would love to make sure that we get that in. But first, let's start with if someone is tuning in because they've just caught this and they are like, this is how I'm going to spend my evening, but they've never heard of the Cherry Robbers. Can you tell us a little bit about what the Cherry Robbers is?
Yeah, so I describe it as a Gothic novel, but it's a lot of things, but it has that a Gothic feel to it. So it has a bookended narrative. So the first and last chapter take place in present day, or 2017, and in those sections we meet this 80-year-old reclusive painter who lives in northern New Mexico, who has some Georgia O'Keeffe vibes, even though she's just a fiction character. And she's, she's very, she's 80, she's reclusive, but she's very, very famous painter. And so at the beginning of the novel, I'm going to read a little bit of this part. She receives a letter from a journalist who says, I know that you've been living under an assumed identity, that Sylvia Wren is not your real name. And I want to talk to you about who I think you really are. And so this sort of turns Sylvia's life really upside down. And she decides that she herself wants to tell the story of what happened to her five sisters back in 1950s Connecticut. So the bulk of the novel takes place in the 50s, and it's Sylvia as an 80-year-old describing what happened to her sisters. And I'm not giving anything away by saying there are the mysterious deaths of her sisters. You know that right from the beginning. But it talks about how they died and what happened to them. So that's kind of the overall gist of it.
Yes, it is. Okay, I know. I'm like, I don't want to get ahead of myself because I guess let's have you do the reading now. If you said you're going to read a little bit from that section, and then I'll ask my next question because I don't want to get ahead of us too much.
Okay, so so this is in the 2017 part of the beginning. And Sylvia has just gone to the post office and collected her mail. And so now she's back home with what she got at the post office. So I'm part of this. I'm going to be reading a letter from somebody else, so I'll try and change my tone so it's not confusing. Okay. My study is at the back of the house. My desk positioned in front of the window that overlooks the flower garden and the hills, with the Cerro Pedernal in the distance, a mesa that looks like a neck with no head. The rocky hills behind the house are red, almost Martian in appearance. They deserve to be called otherworldly when so few things described that way actually do. I sorted through the letters, fighting the urge to dump them somewhere. I have to make an effort at practicality while Lola's gone. She's the one who normally handles that part of our life, paying the bills, doing the shopping, calling the plumber. I removed the electric bill from the stack of letters, then separated what was clearly fan mail, the airmail envelopes from Japan and South Africa, and the more familiar American envelopes, almost all of them with feminine handwriting. It was mostly women and girls who write to me. I'm not an artist, after all, but a woman artist. There were two more letters that I would pass along to my assistant, both on professional-looking stationery, the addresses typewritten, one from the University of Nebraska, the other from a woman in Greenwich, Connecticut, both almost certainly requests for something I would refuse to do. But I at least peek at some of the letters, so I'm not completely out of touch. The letter from Connecticut was the obvious choice. I tore it open and pulled out the sheets of slightly pebbly, pale blue stationery. On the first page, printed at the top, it said, Eliza L. Mortimer, journalist and documentary filmmaker. Dear Miss Wren, the letter began, I'm a great admirer of your work. I groaned. Eliza, surely you could come up with something better than that. I've been desperate to get in touch with you. I'm a freelance journalist and documentary filmmaker covering the art world. I called your agent, hoping to connect with you, but he said you won't talk to journalists under any circumstances and refused to even forward my letter. Finally, after working through many of my contacts, a friend of a friend was able to get your mailing address from a gallery owner. I'm sure you'll understand that I don't want to say who it was. I hope this letter has actually made its way to you. I understand that you don't want to be bothered, but ... On and on she went about how she loves my work and how she has a framed poster of the purple iris hanging in her bedroom. I didn't like the thought of my paintings as posters, as postcards, and likely as coasters and magnets and keychains. Why had I ever agreed to that? Accessibility, my lawyer had said when I'd signed a licensing agreement. Art should be accessible to the masses. She'd implied I'm a snob, which is not the case. With my success, I could be living in a villa in the south of France, surrounded by acolytes and attending fancy parties, but instead I live in a modest adobe house and drive a 14-year-old car, finding pleasure not in the world, but in my work, engaging each day in the ritual communion that produces it. I don't think it's too much to ask that this work not be turned into tacky trinkets destined to clog up a landfill. I was about to abandon Eliza's letter since it was obvious her flattery was building up to an interview request, but my eye caught the start of the next paragraph. At a recent luncheon at the Sandler Museum, I was seated next to a woman who grew up in Bellflower Village, Connecticut. I inhaled quickly, a stabby breath of panic. Her name is Pauline Levasseur, and she's an art collector who splits her time between New York and Paris. She keeps a rather low profile and isn't flashy the way so many collectors are. Her maiden name was Pauline Popplewell. When I told her I'm based in Greenwich, she told me she grew up nearby in Bellflower Village. She recalled her childhood there fondly, saying she lived on St. Ronan Street in a big Victorian painted robin's egg blue that, according to her, was the prettiest house in town. I'm wondering if any of this sounds familiar to you. I laughed audibly, more like a scoff of confusion, alarm. Why would it be familiar to me? I'm Sylvia Wren, an artist who lives in Abiquiu, New Mexico. I was born and raised in Illinois, and now I'm a New Mexican. I know nothing of New England, or at least that's what I tell people. But I kept reading the letter because Bellflower Village, the Popplewells, and the house in Robin's Egg Blue are not actually unknown to me, or rather to the person I used to be. I don't mean to be coy, Miss Wren, so let me get to the point. Mrs. Levasseur had a bit too much champagne and let slip that she knows a secret about you. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. If I pretended I hadn't opened it, maybe I could keep whatever it portended from happening. It's not possible to rewind time, but I was willing to try. I stuffed the envelope into the stack of letters, closed my eyes, and imagined I had just returned home from the post office, sat down at the desk, and hadn't opened a thing.
Thank you so much for reading that. Imagine us all clapping at home.
I'm imagining. People enjoyed that.
I love how you chose to open this book. I'm like, I realized I was like acting shocked to my facial expressions like the whole time. And I'm like, I've read this. I know exactly what that is. I know what she's about to say even next. But it just, I think, I know this has to be a goal of every author, but you accomplished that task of like, from the minute that I started this book, I was like, I have to know more. Like, what is going on here? It just hooked me immediately. And especially the way that chapter ends, I was like, let's go. Like, tell me more. So I'm thrilled to talk about this a little bit more. The first thing I want to like start in is that I thought I saw you in an article that was about the book that you were working on this story for quite a while before like we actually got to see this final product. So like how long were you working on it, and like what is its origin story? Where did this idea initially come from?
Yes, so I first kind of came up with a little seed of the idea that eventually would become this novel about 10 years ago. So it's been a long time. And I wasn't even finished writing Dietland when I thought of it. But, you know, I was working on Dietland for so long, and I was just kind of fantasizing about what I might do next. And so I had this idea, you know, Dietland was very plugged into the present moment and was very much, you know, everything that was happening today. And so I really wanted to write an historical novel. I thought I just don't want to deal with the contemporary anymore. I want to go in the past and just have a break. So just a break from just looking, you know, at the culture that we're living in today. So I wanted to write something historical. I wanted to write something about sisters, but I honestly don't know where that came from. It just kind of popped into my head. I mean, so much of it, you know, it just kind of comes from somewhere, but you don't really know where. And then, you know, I knew it wanted to be kind of a twisted story. So I thought, you know, well, the sisters, or most of them or all of them, you know, I hadn't decided, are going to die of, you know, some mysterious cause. And it's going to be like really creepy. So that was kind of the beginning of it, you know, and then, you know, it was in my head for years, just kind of, you know, changing and everything evolving as I worked on Dietland. And then, you know, even when Dietland was published, then I was, you know, I taught for a while, and then I was working on the Dietland TV show a little bit. So I never really had time to work on it until about 2018, really. So I just kind of had to sit there for a long time, but it's not ideal when that happens. You have to, as a writer, you have to really work to keep an idea fresh if it's been in your head for a really long time. So it can really kind of push you to, you know, keep making the story new and fresh and exciting for yourself. So that was one of the challenges that I had with it.
That makes a lot of sense. That's something that like we receive as a reader, like it feels very fresh, and we also spend like a much different amount of time with it, even regardless, typically, you know, the average reader. And so it would make sense that would take a second to keep it fresh if you were having to sit on it for so long. I'm really glad that you did and that we got this, because I'm sure there were times that you wanted to also just move on to like your next thing. But that's really interesting to know that, like, because Dietland was contemporary, like I am always interested when authors kind of switch around genres, like whether that was always the plan or like what leads to that. But yeah, so that's just like fascinating. I do have lots of questions about the sisters. The first one being, were there always this many of them, or did that like change over like the course of writing them? Did you add anybody in, or has this always been kind of a set cast from the beginning?
So originally there were more. There were 7 altogether. Yes, 7 Chapel sisters. I guess I didn't say. Sorry, when I did my summary at the beginning, I didn't say that that they live in this big Victorian mansion in Connecticut, and that their father owns this big firearms company, the Chapel Firearms. That's sort of inspired by the Winchester repeating arms company. And so they're this very wealthy family. And I didn't mention that part, but yeah, so there's these 6 sisters. They live in this wedding cake mansion. They're kind of confined to this wing of the house, the girls' wing, where all their walls are painted with flowers. And, it's kind of, in a way, I mean, it's kind of this, they feel kind of imprisoned there, but for the reader, I wanted it to be very lush. All the details in the books be very vivid and lush. So I had a lot of fun creating their world, but originally they were 7 of them. I like the symbolism, and the mythology of like the 7 sisters. But it's hard to write a book with that many characters. I mean, even 6 was like tremendously difficult, and I just couldn't do 7, so it just didn't work. So yeah, I got rid of 1, but I mean that she wasn't really even a character. It was no, she had never become a character. But yeah, so 6 of them. But it's a challenge, having that many main characters, and they're all girls. So like, how do I differentiate them so that they stand apart in the reader's mind? Because in a book, all you have is text. It's not like on TV or film where you can see different people. So that was one of the big challenges of writing it.
I was wondering about that because one of the first things, I think that you've written such a like lush and vivid, like I felt like I knew so many details, not in a like overly detailed way. I just felt like I had a very like great entry into what this world is and like what my setting was as a reader. But I was like, these characters are so distinct. Like each sister has their own thing going on. But I can't imagine how difficult that was to accomplish that because it feels seamless. But it's just,
well, that's good. That's good. Thank you.
That's always the goal, right? It very much felt seamless, and it very much like there was no issue keeping track of who was who and like what each vibe was. I felt like you gave them each such distinctiveness. And yeah, so I just like wondered about that process a little bit because obviously we also have to get very attached to them of like death of any kind is sad, but like part of being a reader is that you want like when a death happens as like is shown that is imminently going to happen, you kind of tell us from the beginning, the kind of the not nursery rhyme, but like kind of the rhyme around the sisters, right? Which is, oh my gosh, now I'm blanking on, I thought about it all day long. And then what is the rhyme? It's,
first they get married, then they get buried.
Yes. So like, what's coming as a reader. You're like, okay, so I thought it was just so well done. And like, part of it is, as a reader, you kind of go into it knowing a little bit more of like the theme for what's going to happen versus like the sisters themselves knowing this, especially even after the first sister dies. But so again, we're keeping it spoiler free. These are all things that you'll like have an idea of going into it. But so for many of them, like all of this centers around marriage. And for each of the sisters, like there's usually some kind of reason or like escape that marriage is offering, or like some kind of different like social status that especially for a woman in like the 1950s, like what that would mean. And so what was important to you to convey to the reader kind of through their stories? I guess I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so I mean, the 50s setting gave me a lot to play with there's a whole thing of the 50s housewife, this kind kind of, I guess, mythological character in American pop culture, the white middle class 50s housewife. And there's so many stories, about that. Some that I thought of while I was writing, Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates with April Wheeler. It's like this iconic Connecticut 1950s housewife, of course, had a very tragic end. And I thought of, like The Hours, Michael Cunningham, and the character Laura Brown that Julianne Moore played in the film. All these kind of unhappy housewives. And so, by thinking about the marriage in the novel, first they get married, then they get buried, was in that 1950s context. And thinking about the kind of stories that existed about marriage and everything at that, either at that time or things set in that time from today. And the two oldest sisters are very, very excited to get married. I mean, it's not like they're being forced into it. They want to get married. They're excited about it, even if their mother tries to stop them. They want to do it. Of course, you see the cultural pressure that, they feel like that's really their only option in life. But yes, they chose it, but it's kind of from a very constricted pool of choices that they have. They're very excited about it. And I wanted to do that. I think it would have been easy for me to make it so that, they were being forced into it. They didn't want to get married and, that kind of thing. I think it was more interesting that they were very into it. And then, so my version of writing about the 1950s and marriage and all of that was like through a Gothic horror kind of device, so there's a novel that's based in reality, but at the center of it, if something happens to the sisters, it's not based in reality. It's not realistic. I kind of compare it sometimes to Kate Atkinson's Life After Life. Again, this big sprawling family saga, based in reality, but then at the center of it, in that novel, Ursula dies and comes back to life many, many times. And so my novel with the sisters and how they die, is something that's from horror, Gothic horror. And so I liked kind of taking that traditional marriage and housewife story from that time and then giving it that Gothic, scary, spooky spin. And so that was kind of my spin on the marriage story from that era. But I think that it really resonates today, especially with so many cultural and political things that are happening, that it's scary, that it's as relevant as it is, that shouldn't be as relevant today, but it is,
Yes, I wish it wasn't as relevant as it was. Yes, well, and I also think as the reader, it keeps it very fresh that kind of there's this ongoing, they start out being excited to get married, and then you start to feel the tension as a pattern starts to form, and like getting to see that unfold. Really, like, I think it's very hard, and you accomplish this so incredibly well, to write a like character-driven book that also feels as propulsive as the Cherry Robbers feels, because you're always like I had such a hard time finding places to stop in my reading. I'd be like, I'm so tired, I have to go to bed, but I'd be like, just one more number, I'll just read till I'll just find out what happens in this spot. And you keep us going so well there. So I really loved that. I'm sure it's incredibly hard. Like, you can't ask somebody to pick a favorite. So I would not ask you to pick a favorite of your 6 Chapel sisters, but maybe if you can just tell us a little bit about how different sisters captured your heart in different ways as you wrote them.
Yeah, okay. I really like that question. No one's ever asked me that before. So there's the 6 sisters. So the main character is the 5th sister, Iris. So you meet her at the beginning as Sylvia Wren, but her real name is Iris Chapel. And so she's the main character, the 5th sister. And I like doing it that way, or I needed to do it that way, because I needed the sister who was the main focus to be sort of at the tail end of, she couldn't be the oldest, I needed to have the other sisters go first, even though she has one younger sister. So she's like our viewpoint character. So, she's the one that I was closest to, because I was living in her head for a long time. And I had so much fun with her when she was in her 80-year-old self. That was like really fun to write, just how cranky and difficult she was. I think I have like a fantasy of being like that myself, being like very reclusive and cranky, not caring what anybody thinks. But as her younger self, I really, um, she was the character that most actively seeks her kind of liberation. Some of her other sisters wanted that as well, but she was the one, she listened to her mother's warnings, and took that seriously, that maternal knowledge, and which ultimately had an enormous impact on her fate. So I feel like she's a real fighter and a real survivor, Iris. But the oldest sister is Aster, and I had a lot of fun. I had fun with all of them, but she's the most responsible and the most obedient. She's like a surrogate mother, because their own mother, loves them, but just isn't equipped to be a mother. Never really wanted to be one. So Aster is really the mother of her younger sisters, and then the first to get married and the first for everything that happens in the novel. So she was kind of that anchor, and I really needed that kind of a character for the others to play off against too. The second oldest, Rosalind, was probably my favorite to write, just because she had a more fun personality, at least, early on. Yeah. With her zingers and one-liners. I mean, this is an American family, but to me, she was like some British. She had a kind of British sensibility to her and her language and everything. Yeah, so she was fun. She was also, second oldest, but not responsible like Aster. And then we have Calla, who I loved writing her as well. And she's the poet, and she's this romantic, not in the sense of wanting really to get married or anything. She really doesn't want that, but just kind of romantic in terms of her worldview and her poetry and her books. And she's the more literary sister of all of them. And then Daphne is next, and she is the most rebellious. So she, is the one that breaks all the rules. They're all very obedient, but she breaks the rules. She's the rule breaker. So she was fun to write in that way, and has a really big impact on Iris and who she eventually becomes, because Daphne is a painter, and then Iris eventually becomes a painter herself. So, and then there's Iris, I already talked about, and then Zelly, the youngest. So Iris and Zelly have a very special bond. So it was, really interesting experience to write about the two of them. It's two separate characters, but how they play off of each other. And Zelly's definitely, the youngest. So she's the baby. And Iris, even though Iris is just a couple years older than her, she really kind of mothers her in a way. And spends a great deal of the book trying to convince her sister to make different choices in life. And it's part of I don't want to give anything away, but that's sort of probably the most difficult thing that will ever happen to her in her life, is her relationship with Zelly.
Yeah.
And what happens. So
yeah. Yes, they were so fun to experience as a reader. I didn't realize until we didn't have them anymore that I was so into, specifically because I appreciate them all as individuals, and then I loved some of the dynamics that you put between them, right? I also think that's another layer that is very fun, is that not only are they 6 distinct characters, but then they all have kind of different ways that they interact with each other. Like Aster and Rosalind being Aster kind of being the person that softens Rosalind, or just goes oh, Rosie, kind of really, because even though when Aster's gone and we're hearing Rosalind talk, you're oh yeah, she's a little harsh sometimes, but you're so into it when she captures your heart right away. I was very much, it's so funny to hear you say that you kind of pictured her being kind of this British whatever, because for whatever reason, I don't know why I'm blanking on her name, but Maggie Smith's character in Downton Abbey is kind of how I would picture her kind of delivering barbs in that way too.
Yes.
so like lovable that you're like, it's fine. It's fine. You just said something kind of mean, but it's fine. I don't care. So thank you for telling us kind of how they meant to you. Is there like any part of you that's in one of the characters? Or is there a lot of parts of you in all of the characters? Or is there like one character? You said like Iris is kind of who you like aspire to be as her like 80-year-old self. Was there any parts of you like that were more a part of a character than others?
I mean, I would say she is probably the most relatable to me. I mean, Aster, I don't really personally relate to that much. Her roles are very different from me. Kala, as the writer, I like that aspect of her. But yeah, probably Iris. I mean, obviously she has some of me in her since she came from my brain. And then, but in other parts of her that are very different from me. But yeah, I mean, I feel a connection. I mean, when you're writing a character, just the same thing like when I had Plum and Dietland. And you kind of develop this attachment to this character, even though they aren't, a real person, but they become very real because you're sort of living in their mind for a long period of time. So I can't help but have that kind of attachment to her and to Plum, that will never end really.
Yeah, actually, this is a question I always enjoy asking. And so you teed this up perfectly. Like, I've started to think of this because as a reader, we have a finite period of time with a book. Maybe some of us are better at like, if we know we're going to be very sad, like dragging out our reading period. But, regardless, we only have the amount of time that we spent with the book reading it from start to finish. But as the author, you've spent so much more time going through different iterations and like coming up with this final product and developing the characters and shifting things out and doing all of the things. Is there anything that you like miss about writing this book? Or was it kind of like when you were done with it, you were like happy with it and happy to see it also go? Like you were ready to move on to your next thing.
It's kind of mixed. I mean, it's partly so there's always a moment, at least with Dietland, the Cherry Robbers, where the book was like finally finished. I don't mean my part finished, like writing it, because there's a lot more that goes into a book. Like it doesn't really end. It kind of limps along for a while. You finish the book and then, it's edited and then it's copy edited and then a proofreader reads it and then there's page proofs. There's all this stuff that goes on for months and months. And so it doesn't end right away, even when you're done kind of writing it. But there's always a moment where, for both of my books, where I was done, the page proofs were done. I had done every, proofreading, copy editing done. And that was it. And there was this really sad feeling. Like I was very glad to be done, but almost like this kind of grief feeling of like, that's it. Like I'll never be. So there's like, as the writer, you're in that world, and then you have to, when you're done, you are out of it. So you're looking at it from the outside in. You'll never be inside of it again. And there's always this grief that I experience, and it's really sad. It makes me feel really, really sad that it's kind of like I can feel them like leaving me. And so yeah, I experienced that, and then but for the most part, you're tired of it as well and you want to go on to something else. So it's like this really weird kind of mixed feelings of like being excited but being sad.
Yeah.
But I wrote most of it during the pandemic. I mean, I was deep into it before that, and I had all these deadlines I had to meet, and here's all this stuff happening in the world and the terror everyone was feeling when this COVID started and the lockdowns. I was living in California at the time, which was very strict lockdowns, and it was this terrifying time. But I had to work on this book. But in a way, it like saved my sanity, because every day, even though it was, it's a dark world of the story, but every day I could escape what was happening in our reality and go into Bellflower Village, into this Victorian mansion with all of these sisters. And it was like an escape. I mean, it really saved my sanity. So I think that was something that I'll always be glad that I had, that I was really deep into a novel when that pandemic started, so that I could go into that world. And it really is like going into a world, at the beginning of the writing day. It's like Narnia or something. You go in and you're in this other reality. And it was just so nice to have that, so I could escape from what was happening in the real world around me. So
yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I definitely have heard authors speak to, they miss spending time in this world. They miss spending time with their characters, but also the way that COVID-19 has impacted all of us in different ways, and the meaning that it has when you had that to work on during it is, because it's an intense book. It is intense in so many ways, but also there's so much comfort in like the sisters and their relationship to each other, and all of that I can totally see that. Moving a little bit away from the characters, even though I could talk about them forever, as evidenced, what was your research process like for this book? Yes, I guess let's start there, and then I have kind of a follow-up to that. But what was your research process like for this book?
So I always, I did a PhD, so I know how to
be a good researcher. I know that.
Remember, it doesn't come naturally to me because I am more a creative person. So I really could never be like an academic. Okay. That just is not me. But somehow I got through the PhD somehow. So I always start off like, I'm buying all these books, because of course I love buying books to research, and this and that and everything. And then, I just didn't end up needing all of that. It's sort of, for me, I know there are people who write historical novels who, spend years researching like everything. And, that's their process, but that's just not me. I really just like the creative part of it. I don't want to be bogged down in all this historical research. So, I just kind of ended up taking what I needed. I read this biography of Sarah Winchester. I read a biography of Emily Dickinson, which is very important to me, and different books about her. And, I had old magazines. That was actually really helpful. I got on eBay old copies of Mademoiselle and Glamour and 17 from the years, and wedding magazines. So that was kind of research, but more fun. You can look at all these pictures and ads. So I had fun with that, but I also just I didn't get overwhelmed by it because I just rather be more creative. In the 1950s, I wasn't, around then, but it just feels more real to me because, it's just more recent, at least for someone from Generation X. So it wasn't super foreign, there were things I had to research, but I kind of had a good sense of what it was like. I did research, but didn't let myself get overwhelmed in it because I just felt like I just wanted to use my creativity more than making it like research heavy.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I am interested, why Emily Dickinson? It makes sense to me, but also why? I just want to hear you talk to it.
Yeah, I quote her a couple times, these very small quotes, because of the Calla, who's the poet. But so when I was first kind of getting ready to write this book and thinking about, the world of it, I knew I wanted this world and this very vivid and lush world. But that takes time to create. I don't just have it built. You have to build it in your head. And so somehow thankfully I picked up this biography of Emily Dickinson by Lyndall Gordon called Lives Like Loaded Guns, which is, from one of Emily Dickinson's poems. And she really influenced the novel. She is a very Gothic figure. Her poetry is very Gothic. She's in New England, and she was this woman who was very confined to her home, which influenced me a lot for the character of the mother in the novel. She wears these white dresses, and her poetry, the part about her poetry influenced for Calla, but, her gardens. So, most people in the Victorian area loved gardens. They loved flowers, not just the flowers themselves, but the symbolism of flowers. So I started reading a lot about her flowers. I read 2 books about her gardens and her flowers. And that really influenced the flower. The flowers were already in the novel, but it really influenced that a lot. So she just influenced a lot of things in terms of the world building for me as the writer, which may not be in any way obvious to the reader, but it's in the foundation of the novel that I needed as the author. So she was very influential in that way.
That's wonderful to know. What is it? I have to ask, have you seen Dickinson on Apple TV?
It's Apple. You know what? Okay, I have not seen it. I know that's horrible because I know so many people say it's great, but I feel like I I know, maybe I just sound old when I say this, but it just seems so weird to me that they've made her some kind of contemporary, but or not contemporary, but they've given her a contemporary sensibility, but back
Yeah, yes.
try it. I really should. I don't know. I'm very like, I mean, people get very territorial about certain writers that they like. And so I just feel like, I don't know, but I might try it.
It's, you know what? I think it's great, but also I completely understand getting territorial over like, you're like, no, that's not what it would be. So it makes sense if that would be a little too close to doing that. It just like really renewed my like, I remember being very into her. And then like when I watched that show when it came out, I was like, deep dive, Emily Dickinson, let's go. So
I mean, that's great. I'm sure it got a lot more people interested in her, which is great. So introducing her to new generations to become Emily fangirls.
yeah. Keep it going. Keep it going. Oh my gosh. Yes. I do you also mentioned Sarah Winchester and the mom, I don't think we've said this yet. We just talked about the mom, but I don't think we've said explicitly like, so part of like how the mom's, you mentioned before, like she loves her daughters, but she's not capable of really like being there for them. And she kind of has this whole backstory that unfolds as well that you get to understand, that she didn't really necessarily want to be a mother. But that wasn't really a choice. But also part of her story is that she sees the ghosts of people. We mentioned that the Chapel family like owns a firearms company. And her thing is that she believes that the house is haunted and that she sees people who have been victims of the firearms that the company makes. And so I want to bring that up because obviously there's a lot going on in our world right now. Over the past couple of weeks since the book came out, unfortunately, we've had several mass shootings that have been horrific. And so where do you see your novel kind of being a part of that? Like, I know that we've had this history. It's not just been the past couple of weeks, but it felt like you were very intentional in kind of bringing that into it. And then in part of the story. And also I know that there's kind of, whether it's proven or not, Sarah Winchester, I believe also like there is thoughts that she also believed as a real person that she was haunted similarly. So I guess I'll stop blabbing. I feel like I'm blabbering right now, but where do you see the chair robbers kind of fitting into that narrative and thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a horrible couple weeks, I mean, just, horrific events happening at the time that I've been out talking about the book. I would say, the book, so in the book itself, there's not gun violence in the book. It's just that this family the Chapel family owns this firearms company. And so that's how it comes into the novel. And so mostly it's dealt with in that historical context. The Chapel rifles are very much inspired by the Winchester rifles, which, maybe younger people might not be as familiar with that, but, these iconic, the repeating rifle that were used in the Civil War and, so-called, westward expansion, the conquering of the American West and World War I and II. And then there were movies made, I have a movie in the book called Chapel 70, which is my spin on the real movie, Winchester. I can't remember. But anyway, it's a Winchester movie with Jimmy Stewart. And so, it's this very iconic weapon. And so the mother in the novel is inspired by Sarah Winchester, as you mentioned, who the legend goes, she had married into the Winchester family, and then her husband died. She inherited all of his money, and she moved to San Jose and built this enormous house that you can visit now. It's called the Winchester Mystery House. And the legend goes that she thought she was haunted by the spirits of people killed by the Winchester rifle. So I took that little aspect of her and gave it to the character in my novel. So, the mother in the novel has a very tortured relationship with the fact that she married a man whose family for generations has owned this firearms company. And she doesn't, everyone else thinks it's great, and she is haunted by it and thinks it's horrible. And so, part of it is writing about how, guns are just such a part of American history, and part of New England culture as well, since that's where almost all the firearm companies were, in Connecticut and, Massachusetts. And that kind of history of where the story is set, but then also using it to, write about, well, why, in some ways, of why is the mother, why is she haunted by these rifles, and how does that connect to the story of the Chapel sisters themselves? And I don't spell that out in the novel, but I think that, I hope people can think about what they think it means. But I think the character, she's just very attuned to like domination and violence, and she sees that with the guns, this violent culture, and then she sees a form of that mirrored in her own personal life. So she's not a victim of like literal violence, but she sees this oppression that she's had to live under, as this woman who was kind of basically forced into marriage and had these kids that she didn't really want. And she sees that's a form of domination as well. So I'm trying to explore different ideas of violence and domination. And that's kind of how I make use of the guns in the novel in different ways. But I don't really explicitly draw those connections, but I hope it's there for the reader to think about.
Definitely is. I can attest as a reader, and maybe everyone else watching can attest too, if you have finished it, that I was just like, I think this would make a brilliant book club for people to discuss, because there is so much there of a lot of different themes. Some other ones that maybe we haven't even mentioned yet, but like some like sexuality and like women's role in home. There's a lot of feminism to discuss. Like there's a lot going on that gives such a lush conversation and just kind of discussing ideas back and forth. And so I definitely think that the reader, like you led us where we need to go without having to specifically spell it out for us, which I think is also a very special talent that not everyone has. I did want to ask, because we covered this a little bit earlier, but Dietland is contemporary. And obviously this is Gothic and historical fiction. And so like a very different genre. And you've spoken to like why you thought that. But was it difficult at all to make that switch? Was it like, what was the hardest part about writing a Gothic novel? Because you do it so brilliantly that maybe it was flawless, but I like would imagine it. I feel like anything that feels extremely flawless to us usually has a lot going on that the author had to do behind the scenes. So yeah, what was that like to kind of do that switch of genres?
It was really difficult. I didn't want to just write the same story again. I thought it would be easier, to just kind of write a similar type of story to Dietland. And I wanted to do something really different, because I just think it's boring. For me, I get bored. So I wanted a totally new challenge. But, because they are so different, I felt like The Cherry Robbers was like a first novel that I was kind of, of course I learned things from Dietland, but it was really like starting over again, having to figure out how to write a novel all over again, because it was just so completely different. And so I was talking to a writer friend about this, and she was saying, well, most people, Dietland, they may have gone like kind of smaller than Dietland and done something smaller, but you went like bigger. And she's like, that was like a interesting choice. But, I think that's true. I wanted to do something even bigger than that and very different from that. But yeah, it was really difficult in so many ways. So, but my next novel that I'm working on now is also different. It's a different genre. So I think it keeps things interesting. Let's put it that way.
I love that. Are you able to say what genre your next novel is? Is that something we're
yeah, it's a thriller. It's like I say it's like a detective novel. There's no detective in it, but my main character plays that part of a detective, basically. So I've always wanted to write a novel like that. So I'm really excited. I'm having a lot of fun with it. Pretty far into it. Well, over 100 pages, which is
that's awesome. Yeah. I don't know about anyone else, but I love when authors switch around genres, because I feel like, some authors are great at the genre that they write, and that is like so perfect for them. But I love seeing, I love a book that like mixes genres a little bit. And I always feel like if a author has written other genres, like you see a little bit of that come in, even if it's firmly kind of in one, you see some of these other pieces that you don't always get from an author who writes firmly in one genre. So I'm very excited that you keep skipping around, even though I'm sure sometimes you're like, all right, this is keeping it fresh and interesting, but fresh and interesting probably gets old occasionally.
Yeah, the new novel isn't such a beast as the Cherry Robbers. I was like, I'm writing something shorter this time. So it was the third novel has been the easiest, but I don't know what that means, but it's been the easiest one so far.
It feels like maybe that means that you deserved an easy one.
I think the Cherry Robbers, I mean, as I say in the acknowledgments, I abandoned it once. I was like, I can't do this. I'm done. And then I went back to it. But yeah, it almost defeated me. So
what made you, actually, that's so interesting that you bring that up, because I saw that in the acknowledgments and I was like, how dare you have abandoned this once? Like, we needed this book. So what made you come back to it when you almost abandoned it?
I feel like, I felt like an idea that was inevitable. Like, I felt like I just had to write it. I kind of, even when I abandoned it, I knew I was going to have to write it, but
a real abandonment.
Yeah, exactly. I had this other idea that, I thought, well, maybe I'll do that. Maybe I'll do that novel. It was based on a short story that I had written. But it just didn't feel right. It's just, I just knew I would never be able to live with not at least trying to just finish it. And then that was the time that originally, you don't meet Iris as an 80-year-old. That wasn't part of the novel originally. And then that was when I developed that idea that it would be framed by her in the future. And that just sort of changed everything. And then I was able to write it. But that was the missing piece that I didn't have. Okay. So once I did that, everything kind of clicked into place more. But I really had to suffer as a writer to get there.
I'm sorry you did. She was worth it. She's great. I do have one last question before we move into our this or that phase. And it's because I forgot to ask this earlier, and it's one of my favorite questions. So I have to go back to it. Is there anything that was edited out of this book that you still think about?
I mean, there were things edited out, like some big things, but yeah, at the time I was like, oh, I don't know about that, or, I don't know if I can live without it. But then for everything, it was like, I eventually, I think writers sometimes get defensive, they get attached to things, and it's hard to like just be detached and, just think like what really needs to be in here. And then eventually I realized it was right that it needed to go, these various things. So no, I don't think there's anything that got cut out that I wish was back in.
Okay.
No.
I always love hearing like what has been cut out, because like sometimes we'll hear the most interesting things of like, I interviewed an author one time. It was Saba Tahir, and she was like, yeah, book, I can't remember now. It was like book 2 or book 3 of her series had a dragon in it. And like, there's no dragon to be found anywhere now. And everyone in the audience was like, what? Like, we had a dragon and we lost it? She was like, okay, I'm glad that everyone else is sad too. She was like, it was ultimately better for the book. And like, similarly of like, you have to distance yourself from it. But it's always interesting to hear the editing process, even though sometimes I'm sure you would like to not have to revisit that. Melissa has a great question and a great comment. First, thank you, Melissa, for watching. Melissa said, I'm going to need this book. It just moved to the top of my TBR. Thank you so much. I love that you're going into different genres. Sometimes it's like reading the same story over and over when authors stick to one. So Melissa's follow-up question is, what genre do you think is your favorite that you've written so far? And what one have you not tackled that you're interested in?
Well, thank you, Melissa. Gosh, I feel like I've had my 2 novels and then the one I'm working on now. They're all kind of different, and I feel like I like all of them, just for different reasons and in different ways. So I don't have one that I really love the most. I mean, I would say Dietland is probably more my natural voice. The Cherry Robbers was more of a struggle for me because that's not my natural writing style, really. So yeah, but I like them all just for different reasons and in different ways. But in terms of a genre that I'd like to write, well, this isn't really a genre, but I've always wanted to write something that takes place in Europe. I tried in the Cherry Robbers to have part of it take place in Europe just for myself. It didn't work. And then there's another I'm working on now. I originally wanted to take place in Europe, and it wanted to be in Colorado. Just, so anyway, that's one thing I've never been able to do, but I hope one day I can. Yeah, that's, I think I have a very American sensibility. So I guess maybe I just have a hard time, even if my character's American, I don't know. I think that I've just so far at least needed American settings, but I hope one day that I can write something that takes place in Europe.
I hope you can too. That sounds delightful. Also, I'm a liar because I refuse to not ask this question too. So I forgot I also wanted to ask this one, and then I swear we'll do this or that, and we'll end our evening. But what do you think would happen if your characters from Dietland, or if you just want to pick one character like a Plum from Dietland, met our Chapel sisters?
Well, it's funny because I did a podcast with Barnes and Noble that just went up yesterday, and they asked me, or the woman Messer, who interviewed me, said she thought that Dietland, the Cherry Robbers, was a prequel to Dietland.
Interesting.
I never thought about.
Yeah.
And I really liked that idea of kind of the Cherry Robbers, back in the 50s, and then the kind of its sister novel and more of the present day. But I think that, Sylvia doesn't really have time for anybody. So, maybe she and Plum could meet up, but I don't know if she would really even, kind of let her into her house. But I think that Plum would really love the Chapel sisters, though. I think she would love that whole world. So I think she's jealous. Plum was an only child, and I think in Dietland, part of her thing was that she felt very lonely and isolated. And so I think she would be really enamored of this world with all these sisters and being around people all the time, and just in your own home, having all these other girls around you. I think she would find that at least fascinating, even if she wouldn't maybe want it for herself. But
yes, that feels fair and right. Okay, we're going to do our this or that. And the only rule of this or that is that if you don't like one of the two options that I give you, you have to provide your own third option.
Okay.
Very simple, not too difficult. They're all Gothic themed to make sense with our evening. So the first question is Victorian Gothics or like American Southern Gothics?
Victorian, I think. Even though I did my master's degree and my thesis on the Southern Gothics, I do love
it. Oh, I love knowing that now. It's really hard to choose between the two. They're both great.
Yeah, they're both great, but I love Victorian, like, ghost stories. That you can't beat that.
Yes, no, it's true. It's true. Similarly, speaking of we didn't speak of them, but they are brought up in the book. But Brontes, Emily or Charlotte?
I think Charlotte, actually. I mean, I love Emily, but Charlotte was pretty amazing, I think. I mean, poor Emily didn't live long enough to do very much, but I mean, she left behind, amazing novel. But I don't know. I think Charlotte. She's got the mad woman in the attic, which was, there's a bit of that vibe in Cherry Robbers. So
they're both iconic, but Jane Eyre, like, how can we?
Yeah.
Okay, a little bit of a difference for Gothics, but Frankenstein or Dracula?
Frankenstein.
That's the only correct answer. So I'm that was there's only one right answer there. Even though we love a good vampire, Frankenstein is the right answer. Okay, and last this or that, Northanger Abbey or Rebecca?
Well, Rebecca, I read for the first time when I was writing the Cherry Robbers. And it was really influential to me, and I really loved reading that. Not that Northanger Abbey isn't amazing, but I think Rebecca had a more influence on me. So I'll say Rebecca, even though like for the gender politics of that novel are like a nightmare, but for its influence and just, I mean, it's a really cool novel. And has, the mansion and the flowers and just the creepiness. And I just loved it. So
I think that's why I was interested when you said Emily Dickinson earlier, because it makes sense to me that you read Rebecca like while you're writing Cherry Robbers, because that was totally a vibe that I like received from the Cherry Robbers in the best way. And so I was like, oh, Emily, which also makes sense. And of course, like I'm sure all different of our iconic Gothics have influenced the Cherry Robbers in some way, as one would when you're writing another Gothics. But I do feel like it's impressive that the PhD in English read Rebecca for the first time. I love that for you. That's so fun.
I know my PhD was in 1970s feminist fiction, so which was very connected to Dietland. But yeah, so no, I didn't get to read any books like Rebecca for my PhD.
Yes, I feel like people probably think English majors get to read like across everything that you want. It's like you have to go down like a very specific like hole eventually.
Yeah, very, very narrow, yes.
Yeah, it doesn't leave all that much time. Well, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our hour, even though I could talk to you forever about this book, as evidenced by my squeezing in of like 3 additional questions after I already said we were going to be on the last one. So I just want to say thank you so much, both to you and to everyone who is watching. If you missed the beginning, I just want you to know that we still have copies of the Cherry Robbers at the store, and we will continuously have copies. And so if you are in St. Louis, come by, grab one. If you are not in St. Louis, we do ship. So just check it out on our website, which we do update in real time. I hope that if you do not already own this book, our conversation tonight showed you how much you need this book in your life. So that is my final stance on it. But Sarai, thank you so much for being here. Is there anything you want to say before we leave for the evening?
Well, I had a lot of fun. So thank you for your questions, some of which I had never been asked before. So I love that. And I'm so glad that it was in your subscription box. That's just so fun. So I hope people enjoy it. And yeah, as you said, I think it would be a great book to chat about with other people in like a book club or online. So yeah, well, thank you so much. It was a lot of fun.
Yes, thank you. I'm sad that Shirley didn't seem to chime in.
No, she's asleep. I can see her. She's asleep.
Shirley's like, you guys don't need my comments. Well, again, thank you so much, everyone. We will leave this up. So if you want to come back and re-listen to parts of it or send it to a friend, please do. Please spread the word about how amazing this book is. But that is it for this evening, and we will see you all for our next event.
Thank you. Thanks.